70-year-old Margaret lies trapped in her own basement while her sister Helen stands at her funeral, accepting condolences with fake tears. In her empty house, Helen thinks she's pulled off the perfect crime, stealing her sister's whole life and property, while the real Margaret wastes away below, starving in the dark. But the moment a shadow moves across the window, everything changes because someone has been watching every move since day one. And this witness isn't just anyone. They're a former detective who never lost a case. Now Helen's perfect plan starts falling apart as mysterious notes appear at her door and evidence of her crime surfaces one by one. But how far will a desperate sister go to keep her deadly secret? And will Margaret's decades of wisdom be enough to survive long enough for justice to find her? This story will take you on a chilling journey of betrayal, survival, and the ultimate revenge that proves age is just a number when it comes to fighting back. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The casseroles arrived like clockwork. Every evening, another neighbor would appear on Helen's doorstep, arms laden with comfort food and sympathy. She'd accept each dish with perfectly rehearsed grief, her mascara strategically smudged, her black dress pressed just so. Margaret would have loved this, she'd say, dabbing at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. She always said this community was her true family. The living room had become a shrine to her deceased sister. Photos of Margaret and Helen covered every surface. Carefully selected images spanning decades, each showing Helen's supposedly devoted care for her older sister. The crown jewel was a portrait from last Christmas, Helen's arm protectively around Margaret's shoulders as they stood before a glittering tree. Nobody noticed how Margaret's smile seemed strained, how her eyes held a warning that now screamed from every frame. Such a blessing, having a sister like Helen, Mrs. Peterson from next door commented during the memorial service. The way she cared for Margaret these past few years, practically moved in to help with the medications. Helen nodded solemnly, though inside she smirked at how easily her groundwork had paid off. For 3 years she'd been laying the foundation, spreading whispers about Margaret's declining health, orchestrating small accidents that made her sister appear confused, slowly isolating her from lifelong friends. The truth was, Margaret had been sharp as ever. Her only mistake was trusting her younger sister when Helen suggested consolidating their assets for efficiency. Margaret's signature had barely dried on the papers before Helen began executing her plan. The fake medical records had been expensive, but worth every penny. Who would question a death certificate showing natural causes for a woman everyone believed was declining? But Helen hadn't counted on Sarah Chen's dedication to detail. The retired detective had watched the sisters' dynamic shift through her living room window for months, noting every inconsistency. The way Margaret's garden, her pride and joy, was suddenly abandoned last spring. The strange hours Helen kept, always carrying heavy bags into the house late at night. The muffled sounds that sometimes carried across the quiet street, too faint to identify, but enough to feed Sarah's suspicions. Most telling were the prescription bottles Helen ostentatiously picked up from the pharmacy each week. Medications that, according to Sarah's carefully maintained surveillance notes, never seemed to make it to Margaret. Each detail alone meant nothing. Together, they painted a picture that made Sarah's investigative instincts scream. The community rallied around Helen, of course. She played her role flawlessly, the grieving sister, the selfless caretaker, the humble inheritor of Margaret's considerable estate. "I tried to refuse the inheritance," she told anyone who would listen, eyes downcast. "But Margaret insisted. You've given up so much for me," she said. She was always thinking of others. Only Sarah noticed how Helen's designer wardrobe had subtly upgraded, how her car was suddenly this year's model, how contractors were already measuring the house for extensive renovations before Margaret's ashes had even cooled. The neighborhood saw a devoted sister in mourning, Sarah saw a predator counting her gains. In her darkened living room, Sarah added another entry to her growing file. Photographs, recordings, timestamps, patterns of behavior, the evidence mounted. But she knew from decades of experience that timing was everything. Rush in too soon, and Helen would slip through the cracks of reasonable doubt. No, this required patience, precision, and the kind of methodical pressure that made suspects crack. Meanwhile, below Helen's imported marble floors, Margaret tested the strength of ancient pipes, counting steps and measuring shadows. 70 years had taught her many things, chief among them that time was an ally to those who knew how to use it. Every smiling photo Helen displayed above was a weapon waiting to be unleashed. Every mourner who brought casseroles was a witness who would eventually need to reconcile the caring sister they thought they knew with the monster she truly was. Helen's performance was flawless, but even perfect crimes leave traces. And as she basked in the sympathy of her neighbors, she remained oblivious to the razor-sharp mind of the woman watching from across the street. A woman who had built her career on the simple truth that every criminal, no matter how clever, eventually shows their hand. Darkness had a texture. After 12 days in the basement, Margaret could feel its different densities, thicker in the corners where ancient cobwebs stirred, lighter near the tiny window well where morning light struggled through decades of grime. She'd learned to tell time by the way shadows moved across the concrete floor, marking each day's passage with quiet determination. The basement had been her father's domain once, his workshop where he'd taught both his daughters the value of careful observation. Helen had hated these lessons, but Margaret had absorbed every detail. Now, those childhood memories were keeping her alive. She knew the location of every pipe, every electrical conduit, every structural weakness in the century-old foundation. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "Knowledge is a tool, Margaret. The best ones are hidden in plain sight." The water pipe to the kitchen provided more than just the steady drip she collected for drinking. Its vibrations told her when Helen was home, when she was running water, when she had visitors. Margaret had discovered she could press her ear against it and catch fragments of conversations from above, disembodied voices that kept her connected to the world Helen wanted her to forget. Her nursing background proved invaluable. 45 years of emergency room experience had taught her how to regulate her breathing to prevent panic, how to maintain muscle tone in confined spaces, how to ration both resources and strength. The basement's steady 55-degree temperature was uncomfortable, but not lethal. The protein bars Helen grudgingly provided every few days were enough to maintain basic function. Margaret carefully stored one out of every 3, building a reserve for when her sister's cruelty or forgetfulness left her without. But it was the phone that occupied her thoughts most. 20 years ago, their father had installed an emergency line tucked behind a loose brick in the northwest corner. Helen had been away at college then. She'd never known about it. Margaret had glimpsed the ancient cord during her first frantic exploration of her prison, but reaching it required moving the heavy storage shelves Helen had positioned against that wall. Each day, Margaret worked to shift them a fraction of an inch, careful to leave no trace of her efforts. The sounds from above grew more frequent as another day faded. Heels clicking on hardwood, murmured conversations, the occasional burst of theatrical sobbing. Margaret recognized Mrs. Peterson's voice, then old Mr. James from the garden club. Her friends, mourning her while she lay below their feet. The irony might have broken her if she'd had less experience with human darkness. 30 years in the ER had shown her every shade of cruelty people could inflict on one another. She'd learned then that survival wasn't about strength. It was about adaptation. She'd started talking to herself on day 3, maintaining one-sided conversations about her plans, her memories, her observations. It wasn't madness, it was method. Speech kept her mind sharp, her spirit engaged. She described each of Helen's visits in detail, noting her sister's changing demeanor. The initial smug satisfaction had slowly shifted to something more brittle, more uncertain. Something was rattling Helen's confidence. The basement itself became Margaret's ally. Every creak, every settlement, every subtle change in air pressure told a story. She learned which floorboards above signaled Helen's approach, which times of day brought the deepest quiet. Her world had shrunk to less than 400 square feet, but within that space, she was building her resistance. A sudden thud from above made her freeze. Heavy footsteps, erratic and urgent, paced the kitchen floor. Helen's voice carried through the pipes, sharp with agitation. "Who's watching? Who's leaving these notes?" A crash of breaking glass followed, then silence. Margaret smiled in the darkness. Someone out there saw through Helen's performance. Someone was picking at the threads of her perfect deception. Margaret pressed her palm against the cool concrete wall, feeling the subtle vibrations of her sister's movements. Helen wasn't the only one who'd learned from their father's lessons. But while Helen had absorbed his teachings about mechanics and structure, Margaret had grasped something far more valuable: patience. The same patience that had helped her talk down violent patients, guide grieving families, survive countless night shifts, would now serve a different purpose. Her fingers found the small piece of metal she'd worked loose from an old shelf bracket. In the dim light, she continued her methodical scratching on the wall, adding to the calendar she'd created. 13 marks now, each one represented not just a day of captivity, but a day of preparation. Helen thought she'd imprisoned a helpless old woman. She'd forgotten that age brought more than just weakness. It brought wisdom, resilience, and the kind of quiet fury that could outlast any darkness. Sarah Chen's home office looked like a war room. 3 decades of detective work had taught her the value of meticulous documentation, and the wall facing her desk had become a testament to that lesson. Photos, timestamps, and sticky notes covered. A large corkboard, all connected by red strings that mapped out inconsistencies in Helen's story. The retired detective sipped her green tea, reviewing her latest surveillance photos. Helen's nighttime routine had changed dramatically over the past 2 weeks. Instead of her usual 10 p.m. bedroom lights out, she now paced between rooms until early morning, casting restless shadows across drawn curtains. Something was eating at her perfect facade. Sarah's right hand unconsciously traced the scar along her collarbone, a souvenir from her last case before retirement. That investigation had taught her that the most dangerous predators often wore the most convincing masks. Helen's performance as the grieving sister was masterful, but Sarah had spent too many years studying liars to be fooled by theatrical tears. Through her high-powered binoculars, she watched Helen check her mail for the 3rd time that day. This anonymous note Sarah had slipped in yesterday, a simple "I know what you did" written in block letters, had achieved its intended effect. Helen's hands shook as she rifled through the envelopes, her carefully maintained composure cracking. Evidence lined Sarah's desk in neat stacks. Photographs of Margaret's last public appearances showed no signs of the declining health Helen had described to neighbors. Medical records Sarah had quietly obtained through old police contacts revealed no history of the conditions Helen claimed had taken her sister. Most damning were the financial documents showing a sudden transfer of all Margaret's assets just weeks before her supposed death. But it was the basement windows that held Sarah's attention. She'd noticed the new locks Helen had installed, industrial-grade bolts that seemed excessive for a space supposedly used only for storage. More telling were the subtle movements she occasionally caught behind the grimy glass, shadows that shifted against natural light patterns, the distinct impression of human presence. Sarah's recorder captured every detail. Day 14 of surveillance, subject shows increasing signs of stress. 3rd perimeter check today at 1500 hours. Notable, new scratch marks on basement windowsill, approximately 3 millimeters deep. consistent with metal tool, possibly improvised. She'd learned long ago that the smallest details often broke the biggest cases. The neighborhood's daily rhythms provided perfect cover for her observation. Dog walkers, joggers, delivery people. Each passing presence gave her opportunities to study the house from different angles. She'd mapped every entrance, every blind spot, every potential point of weakness. When Helen left for her daily errands, Sarah used the time to photograph suspicious changes to the property. Her police scanner, still set to the local frequency, crackled with routine calls. Sarah kept it on out of habit, but also strategy. If Helen finally snapped under the pressure, Sarah wanted immediate notification. She'd seen too many cases where careful plans dissolved into desperate violence. A movement caught her eye. Helen was in the kitchen, arguing with someone on her phone. Even from across the street, Sarah could read the tension in her posture. The detective grabbed her camera, adjusting the zoom to capture Helen's expression. Fear, not the manufactured grief. She showed the neighbors, but genuine primal fear. Sarah added the new photos to her wall, stepping back to study the pattern they revealed. Helen's calculated efficiency was unraveling. The notes, the surveillance, the growing suspicion from neighbors, each pressure point was carefully designed to make her slip, and in those slips, Sarah knew, the truth would emerge. Her phone buzzed with a text from an old colleague at the station. Records you requested on Helen's past addresses came through. You're going to want to see this. Sarah allowed herself a grim smile. Helen might think she'd orchestrated the perfect crime, but she hadn't counted on facing an opponent who'd spent 3 decades unraveling lies more complex than hers. Opening her laptop, Sarah began compiling her findings into an official report. When the time came to act, every detail would matter. Because somewhere below Helen's feet, Sarah was certain Margaret waited, counting on someone to see through her sister's deadly deception. And Sarah Chen had never left a victim waiting. The law office of Brunswick and Associates occupied the entire 5th floor of downtown's oldest building. Helen sat in the conference room, manicured nails drumming against a stack of inheritance papers. Across the table, Mr. Brunswick's bushy eyebrows furrowed as he reviewed the documents for the 3rd time. "Everything appears to be in order, Mrs. Walker," he said, though something in his tone suggested otherwise. "However, there is the matter of your sister's safety deposit box at First National. As executor of the estate, you'll need to inventory its contents." Helen's fingers stilled. Safety deposit box? The question came out sharper than intended. Margaret had never mentioned a safety deposit box, and after 30 years of practicing law, Brunswick's expression told her he'd caught her surprise. Yes, opened last spring. Rather odd timing considering her declining health. His eyes, keen, despite his age, studied her reaction. The bank requires witnesses for the inventory. Standard procedure for estate settlements. A bead of sweat traced down Helen's spine. She maintained her grieving sister facade, but inside calculations raced. What had Margaret hidden away? More importantly, who else knew about it? Of course, Helen managed dabbing at non-existent tears. Margaret was always so organized. When would you like to schedule the inventory? Back home, Helen's composure cracked the moment her front door closed. She stormed through the house, yanking open drawers, rifling through Margaret's old files. Her sister had always been methodical, keeping records of everything. There had to be something about this safety deposit box. An envelope slid from beneath. A folder, landing face up on the floor. Helen froze. The handwriting wasn't Margaret's. In block letters it read, "The truth stays buried until it doesn't." Her hands trembled as she tore it open, finding only a single photo inside. Margaret's garden from last spring, the roses in full bloom. On the back, another message. "What else did you bury?" The implications hit her like a physical blow. Someone knew. Someone had been watching, gathering evidence, waiting to strike. Helen sank into her father's old armchair, mind racing through possibilities. The neighbors, the bank, That quiet woman across the street who always seemed to be watching. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Check your email." Helen's laptop seemed to take hours to boot up. The email waited in her inbox. Sender. Anonymous. Subject line, Margaret's last amendment. The attachment opened to reveal a document she'd never seen before. A will dated just weeks before she'd locked Margaret away. Every line stripped away her careful plans. The house, the investments, the family artwork, all designated for a charitable trust. Helen's name appeared only once, in a final paragraph that chilled her blood. "To my sister Helen, I leave the truth about her past, sealed in my safety deposit box. May she finally face what she did." Helen's scream echoed through the empty house. Below, Margaret heard it through the pipes and smiled. The hidden phone was still 3 days' work away, but already her sister's perfect plan was unraveling. Each note, each revelation, each crack in Helen's confidence bought Margaret more time to execute her own strategy. In her darkened living room across the street, Sarah Chen added the afternoon's events to her case file. She timed the email perfectly, sending it just as Helen returned from the lawyer's office. The fabricated will amendment was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, not legally binding, but Helen wouldn't know that until she'd already revealed her guilt through her reactions. Helen paced her study until midnight, making frantic calls to Brunswick's office that went unanswered. Each shadow made her jump, each creak of the old house sent her spinning to check dark corners. The papers from the law office mocked her from her desk, inheritance documents that now felt like a trap rather than a triumph. In the basement, Margaret worked steadily at the shelving unit, concealing her salvation. Helen's footsteps tracked, anxiety above, each pass revealing more of the fear Margaret had waited 2 weeks to inspire. Every crash, every curse, every slam of a drawer told Margaret that someone out there was fighting for her. And soon, very soon, she'd be ready to fight for herself. The truth about Helen's past lay waiting in that safety deposit box. Margaret had planned that final twist long before Helen had revealed her true nature. Sometimes the best weapon was simply knowing when and where to plant the seeds of destruction, and Margaret had planted hers perfectly. The emergency room had taught Margaret that panic kills faster than pain. As she worked the metal shelf bracket against the concrete wall, her movements remained steady, deliberate. Each scrape was carefully timed to coincide with Helen's television. Programs or phone conversations, 45 years of handling crisis situations had gifted her with patience that her sister had never understood. Her makeshift calendar now showed 17 marks. 17 days of cataloguing every sound, every vibration, every pattern in her sister's movements. The water pipe had become her lifeline to the world above, carrying fragments of Helen's increasingly agitated phone calls. Today's conversation had been particularly revealing. "I don't care what it costs," Helen had hissed into her phone. "Someone is watching me. I need to know who." Margaret smiled in the darkness. Her sister's composure was cracking, just as she'd predicted. Desperation made people sloppy, and Helen's precise facade was beginning to show fatal flaws. The basement had surrendered its secrets one by one. The old fuse box still contained their father's electric multimeter, forgotten behind loose panels. The tool shelf, though cleared of anything obviously useful, had yielded a treasure trove of small metal pieces from its underside. Even Helen's generous provision of a thin blanket had provided threads that Margaret carefully wove into markers for her quiet work. Most valuable was her medical knowledge. Margaret knew exactly how much sleep deprivation affected judgment, how hunger could be managed through careful rationing, how to maintain muscle strength in confined spaces. Each morning, she completed a silent routine of exercises learned from years of long hospital shifts, stretches, isometric movements, careful joint rotations. The pipes had taught her Helen's schedule: morning coffee at 6, shower at 6:30, front door at 7:15, evening return between 6 and 8, depending on her errands. Late-night pacing, growing more frequent as the anonymous notes continued to appear. Margaret used these patterns to time her work on the storage shelves, blocking the emergency phone. Today marked a crucial milestone. The shelf unit had finally shifted enough to reveal the loose brick her father had installed decades ago. Behind it, the ancient phone line waited. Margaret's fingers trembled as they brushed the cord, not from fear, but anticipation. She'd need 3 more days to create enough space to reach it properly, to ensure she could access it without leaving evidence of movement. A crash from above froze her movements. Helen's footsteps, erratic and heavy, pounded across the kitchen floor. Something had triggered her sister's rage. Margaret pressed her ear to the water pipe, catching fragments of another phone call. Safety deposit box. Can't be opened until... No, you don't understand. Helen's voice cracked with hysteria. There are things in there. Things no one can see. Margaret's smile widened in the darkness. The safety deposit box, her final insurance policy, was doing its work. Helen had always underestimated her, seeing only the aging nurse, never the woman who'd managed trauma centers through disasters, who'd learned to read people as skillfully as medical charts. The shelf bracket had gained another purpose beyond, marking time. Its pointed end, carefully sharpened against concrete, would serve as both tool and weapon if needed. Margaret had seen enough violence in her career to know how to defend herself, but she'd also learned that the best victories came from letting enemies defeat themselves. A new sound drew her attention. A car door closing across the street. Through the tiny window, she caught a glimpse of movement. Someone was watching the house, documenting Helen's unraveling. Margaret didn't know who her ally was, but she recognized the methodical patience of a professional. Her hands returned to their work, steadily widening the gap behind the shelves. Each scratch of metal on concrete was a promise. To herself, to justice, to the truth Helen thought she'd buried. Above, her sister's pacing continued. A predator unknowingly caught in a trap of her own making. Margaret's fingers found the phone line again, tracing its path through the wall. 3 more days. Just 3 more days of careful work, of calculated patience, of letting Helen's fear do its corrosive work. The darkness had become her ally, teaching her its rhythms, showing her that sometimes the greatest strength lay in simply refusing to break. The mirror in Helen's bathroom had become an accusation. Dark circles beneath her eyes betrayed sleepless nights, and her carefully maintained appearance was showing signs of strain. Another anonymous note had arrived that morning. This one different from the others. "Check the roses," it read. "Dead things don't stay buried." She'd spent an hour in Margaret's garden, frantically digging through flower beds, searching for, what? Evidence? Proof? The roses Margaret had tended for decades watched her destruction like silent witnesses. By the time Mrs. Peterson walked, with her morning coffee, Helen's designer dress was stained with soil, her manicured nails broken and dirty. "Helen, dear," Mrs. Peterson's concern seemed genuine, but Helen caught the calculating look in her neighbor's eyes. "Are you quite all right? We've been worried about you, especially after what happened at the bank yesterday." Helen's stomach clenched. Her public meltdown at First National had apparently made the neighborhood gossip circuit. She'd simply been trying to access Margaret's safety deposit box early to find out what secrets it held. The bank manager's refusal had triggered something in her, a moment of rage that had shattered her careful performance. "Just planning a memorial garden," Helen managed, forcing a trembling smile. Margaret loved her roses so much. The lie felt hollow even to her own ears. Mrs. Peterson's answering nod held more suspicion than sympathy. Inside, Helen paced the kitchen, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. Were the sounds coming from the settling foundation, or was Margaret making noise again? The basement had become a source of constant anxiety. Sometimes late at night she swore she could hear scratching, counting, plotting. Her phone buzzed. With another text from an unknown number. "What's in the safety deposit box, Helen? What are you afraid we'll find?" She hurled the phone across the room, watching it shatter against the wall. It was the third phone she'd destroyed this week. The police had started driving by more frequently. Officer Jenkins, who'd known Margaret for years, seemed to find reasons to park across the street. His questions about Margaret's decline had grown more pointed, less easily deflected. Yesterday, he'd asked to see Margaret's medical records, again claiming some inconsistencies needed clearing up. A knock at the door made her jump. Through the peephole, she saw Mr. Brunswick, her lawyer, standing on the porch with a concerned expression. She couldn't face him. Not today. Not after he'd called asking about Margaret's signature on the transfer documents. Something about the strokes not matching her previous signatures. "Mrs. Walker," his voice carried through the door, "we really need to discuss some irregularities in your sister's paperwork. The bank's legal team has raised some questions." Helen pressed herself against the wall, holding her breath until his footsteps retreated. Her carefully constructed world was unraveling thread by thread. The sympathy of neighbors had turned to whispers. The legal protections she'd established were being picked apart by suspicious eyes. In her study, the inheritance papers mocked her from their neat stack. She'd spent months planning every detail, creating a paper trail of Margaret's declining health, building a narrative that nobody would question, but someone had seen through it all. Someone was systematically destroying her alibi, the woman across the street. Chen, was that her name, seemed to be watching every time Helen looked out a window. There was something familiar about her methodical presence, something that tickled at Helen's memory of past mistakes, past close calls. A thud from the basement sent her scrambling for the bottle of pills her doctor had prescribed for grief-related anxiety. As she swallowed two with shaking hands, another sound drifted up through the floor vents, a sound horribly like quiet laughter. "Shut up!" she screamed at the floor, her composure finally shattering. "Shut up! Shut up! Shut up!" Only silence answered, but she could feel Margaret's presence below, patient and calculating, waiting for her to make a mistake. The doorbell rang again. Through the window she saw Mrs. Peterson standing with Officer Jenkins and what looked like a social worker. Their faces held no trace of the neighborhood's former sympathy. Helen sank to the kitchen floor, her back against the cool refrigerator. The notes, the questions, the watching eyes, all of it was closing in. And somewhere in a safety deposit box, Margaret's final trap waited to spring, ready to expose secrets Helen had thought long buried. The old pipes in the basement weren't just carrying water anymore. They were carrying Margaret's revenge. She'd discovered that tapping the copper lines in specific places created resonant sounds that traveled throughout the house. At 3 a.m, when Helen's anxiety was at its peak, Margaret began her nightly symphony of subtle torments. Tap, 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 like a heartbeat in the walls. She counted Helen's footsteps above, tracking her sister's frenzied path from bedroom to kitchen, kitchen to study. Each night the pacing started earlier. Each night the steps grew more erratic. Margaret had spent decades learning patience in emergency rooms, watching for the subtle signs that preceded a breakdown. Helen was displaying every one of them. The storage shelves had finally moved enough. Behind them, the ancient emergency phone waited like a promise. Margaret's fingers trembled as they traced the cord to its junction box. The line was old, probably forgotten, on the utility company's records. But would it still work? She'd only get one chance to find out. A crash from upstairs interrupted her work. Helen's voice carried through the vents, shrill with panic. "I know you're doing this. I know you're trying to drive me crazy." Margaret smiled in the darkness. Her sister had always been prone to projection, accusing others of exactly what she herself was doing. The makeshift calendar on the wall showed 20 marks now. 20 days of careful planning, of learning the house's rhythms, of letting Helen's guilt do its work. The detective across the street, Margaret had glimpsed her through the window, was playing her part perfectly, maintaining a constant, visible presence that heightened Helen's paranoia. Margaret had prepared for her first escape attempt meticulously. The shelf bracket, now sharpened to a crude point, was secured to her waist with threads from her blanket. The water pipe schedule told her Helen would leave for her lawyer's office at 10. The loose window frame she'd been gradually working on for weeks was finally ready. But Helen didn't leave at 10. Instead, heavy footsteps descended the basement stairs. The first time in days Helen had broken her pattern of leaving food at the door. Margaret quickly concealed her tools and positioned herself in her usual corner, adopting the weary posture her sister expected. Helen's face, when she stepped into the dim light, showed the cost of her unraveling. Her expensive makeup couldn't hide the shadows beneath her eyes, the trembling in her hands as she gripped a flashlight. "What are you doing down here?" Helen's voice cracked. "What sounds are you making?" "I hear you at night. Plotting, scratching at the walls." Margaret met her sister's wild gaze with practiced calm. "I'm just sitting here, Helen, like always, like you wanted." Each word was measured, designed to emphasize Helen's instability rather than reveal her own strength. "Liar!" Helen swung the flashlight beam around the basement. "You're doing something. The whole neighborhood is talking. That woman across the street, she knows something." "What did you tell her before? What's in that safety deposit box?" Margaret allowed a small smile to play across her lips. "Maybe the house is trying to tell you something, Helen. Dead things don't always stay buried, do they?" The phrase, echoing the anonymous note, hit Helen like a physical blow. She staggered back, flashlight beam dancing erratically across the walls. You're working with them. Somehow you're communicating." "Don't be ridiculous, Helen. I'm just an old woman in a basement. Isn't that what you told everyone? A sad, declining sister who died peacefully in her sleep." Margaret's voice took on a sing-song quality that she knew would burrow into Helen's psyche. Helen fled up the stairs, slamming the door with enough force to shake dust from the ceiling. Margaret waited until the footsteps retreated, then returned to her work. The confrontation had cost her today's escape attempt, but it had achieved something more valuable: confirmation that her psychological warfare was succeeding. Through the tiny window, she caught a glimpse of movement across the street. The detective was there, watching, documenting. Margaret positioned herself so the faint light would catch her movement. A subtle signal, but enough to confirm what the detective likely suspected, that the deceased sister was very much alive. The phone line was still her best hope, but now she had a backup plan. Helen's deteriorating mental state would eventually draw official intervention. The detective was clearly building a case, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to strike. Margaret's job was to stay alive and keep pushing her sister closer to the edge of revelation. She returned to the pipes, taking up her metal tool. In the quiet house above, Helen had finally stopped pacing. Margaret began her night's work. Tap, 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 sending haunting echoes through the walls of her prison, sometimes the strongest. Weapons were the subtlest ones, and Margaret had 20 days of practice in wielding them. Sarah Chen spread the financial documents across her dining room table, each paper another piece of the puzzle she'd been assembling. Her contact at First National had finally come through with Helen's complete banking history. The pattern was impossible to miss once you knew where to look. 6 cities, 6 elderly victims, 6 mysterious deaths, she muttered, adding notes to her case file. Helen Walker hadn't always been Helen Walker. Every few years, she'd emerged in a new city with a new name, always finding a vulnerable older person to care for. Margaret wasn't her first target. She was just the first one to fight back. The phone records told an equally damning story. In the weeks before Margaret's death, Helen had made multiple calls to a company specializing in forged documents. The same company had been linked to several of her previous identities. Sarah's police contacts had flagged it years ago, but they'd never managed to connect the scattered cases until now. A movement across the street caught her attention. Helen was in Margaret's garden again, frantically digging through the flower beds. Sarah raised her camera, documenting the increasingly erratic behavior. The neighborhood watch group chat was buzzing with concerned messages about Helen's state of mind. Sarah's laptop pinged with an email notification. Her source at the county records office had found something. Property transfers dating back 20 years, each following the same pattern. An elderly person would suddenly transfer everything to a devoted caregiver shortly before their death. The signatures on the documents were expertly forged, but digital analysis showed subtle inconsistencies. "Got you," Sarah whispered, adding the files to her evidence wall. But proving Helen's past crimes wouldn't help Margaret if they didn't act soon enough. The basement window had shown movement yesterday, a deliberate signal that Sarah recognized as a cry for help. Her anonymous tips to the local newspaper had done their work. A young reporter was asking questions about Margaret's sudden decline, comparing medical records that didn't quite add up. The story would break next week, adding public pressure to the growing investigation. A knock at her door made her quickly cover her evidence wall. Officer Jenkins entered, carrying a thick folder. "You were right," he said without preamble. "The prescription records don't match. Helen's been picking up medications that were never actually prescribed, and the doctor who signed Margaret's death certificate doesn't exist." Sarah added this new information to her timeline. Helen's careful facade was cracking, revealing glimpses of a decades-long trail of deception. But the most damning evidence still waited in that safety deposit box, the one Margaret had mentioned to Sarah during their last conversation before disappearing. "There's more," Jenkins continued, pulling out another document. "Remember that case in Denver 5 years ago? The one with the retired teacher who supposedly died of natural causes? DNA from the scene matches items from Helen's trash. Hair, tissues, discarded mail. She's getting sloppy, leaving traces we can use." Sarah's years of experience told her they were approaching a critical moment. Helen's pattern in previous cities had been consistent. Once suspicion started mounting, she would try to tie up loose ends permanently. They needed to move soon, but rushing in without solid evidence would only give Helen a chance to escape. Justice again. Through her window, Sarah watched Helen pacing her kitchen, phone pressed to her ear. Even from this distance, the body language screamed desperation. The carefully constructed identity was falling apart, and beneath it, something dangerous was emerging. Sarah's printer hummed as she compiled her findings into a formal case file. 20 years of victims, 6 different identities, and a pattern of elder abuse that had gone undetected because no one had connected the scattered pieces. Until now. Until Margaret had reached out to her that day in the garden, sharing her suspicions about her sister's true nature. "The safety deposit box," Sarah murmured, reviewing her notes. "That's where Margaret left the proof." Now they just had to keep Helen unraveling long enough to access it legally. Each anonymous note, each piece of evidence surfacing, each suspicious neighbor was another crack in her facade. Sarah picked up her phone, sending a coded message to her contact at the bank. Everything had to be ready when the box could finally be opened. Because whatever Margaret had hidden away in there, she'd known it would be enough to bring her sister's house of lies crashing down. The Wednesday morning garden club meeting at Mrs. Peterson's house had a different energy than usual. 12 pairs of eyes tracked Helen's jerky movements as she stirred her untouched tea for the 20th time. The whispers had become impossible to ignore, spreading through the neighborhood like poison ivy through a neglected garden. "Did you see her yesterday?" Mrs. Peterson's stage whisper carried deliberately across the room. "Digging in Margaret's roses at midnight with a flashlight. And when I asked if she needed help, she screamed something about things being buried." Helen's spoon clinked against fine china as her hand trembled. They were watching her, all of them. Their sympathy had curdled into something darker, more questioning. Even Margaret's prized roses, displayed in the centerpiece, seemed to be accusing her with their blood-red petals. "Such a shame about those medical records," Eleanor Thompson added, her voice dripping false concern. "My son, you know, the one at County General, He says they can't find any record of Margaret's declining health. Isn't that strange? The teacup slipped from Helen's grasp, shattering on the hardwood floor. The sound of breaking china cut through the pretense of polite conversation. As she knelt to clean up the mess, her designer dress soaking up spilled tea, another anonymous note fell from her pocket. Martha Williams was fastest, snatching up the paper before Helen could reach it. Her eyes widened as she read aloud. "Roses are red, violets are blue, Margaret's not dead and I can prove it too." Helen lunged for the note, her carefully maintained composure cracking completely. "Give that to me. Those are private. You're all conspiring against me, aren't you? Working with that woman across the street." The room fell silent, every pretense of social niceties evaporating. Mrs. Peterson stood, her small frame somehow imposing. "Helen, dear, I think perhaps you should talk to someone. Professional help, you understand. We're all concerned about your state of mind." "My state of mind?" Helen's laugh held an edge of hysteria. "You don't know anything. Margaret was sick. She needed me. I took care of her." Even to her own ears, the words sounded hollow, rehearsed. Through the living room window, she caught a glimpse of Detective Chen photographing something in her yard. The woman's constant presence had become a silent accusation, a reminder that someone was collecting every crack in her performance. "Did she need you, Helen?" Eleanor's quiet question cut like a knife. "Or did you need her assets? Her house? Her life insurance?" The room's temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as the implications hung in the air. Helen staggered to her feet, tea-stained and wild-eyed. The faces around her had transformed from nosy neighbors into a jury, their years of friendship evaporating in the heat of suspicion. She backed toward the door, but not before catching fragments of whispered conversations. "Just like that case in Denver. Forged signatures. Always said Margaret was afraid of—" The walk home became a gauntlet of stares. "Officer." Jenkins drove by slowly, his usual friendly wave replaced by careful observation. The paperboy stopped mid-throw, her morning newspaper landing in a puddle. Even old Mr. Rogers, who'd been half-blind for a decade, seemed to track her movements from his porch. Inside her house, Margaret's house, a voice whispered treacherously. The walls felt like they were closing in. The photos of sisterly devotion mocked her from every surface. Margaret's eyes in each frame seemed to hold a knowing gleam, as if she'd planned this all along. A thud from the basement made her jump. The sounds were getting worse, more deliberate. Sometimes she swore she could hear Margaret laughing, plotting, waiting for her to break. The house itself had become an enemy, carrying whispers through its pipes and shadows through its halls. Her phone buzzed with a news alert. Local woman's death raises questions. Anonymous source reveals inconsistencies. The headlines swam before her eyes. They were closing in, all of them. The neighbors, the police, the ghost of her sister that refused to stay buried. In the basement, Margaret heard Helen's scream of frustration and smiled. The community she'd built over decades was becoming her weapon. Each concerned neighbor another crack in Helen's facade. Soon, very soon, the pressure would become unbearable. And when Helen finally shattered, Margaret would be ready. 3 empty wine bottles lay scattered across Helen's kitchen floor, testament to her crumbling self-control. The morning newspaper's headline glared up at her. Questions surround local woman's death. Police reopen investigation. Her own face, stared back from the grainy photo, caught in an unflattering moment of panic outside the bank. The house phone rang again, the 7th call from Mr. Brunswick's office today. She'd stopped answering after his last voicemail mentioned serious discrepancies in Margaret's signature. The mobile phone she'd replaced yesterday buzzed constantly with texts from unknown numbers, each one more threatening than the last. Found. Your Denver records. Interesting reading. How many others before Margaret? The basement holds secrets, doesn't it? Helen hurled the phone against the wall, adding its shattered remains to the growing collection. Her reflection in the window caught her attention. Mascara streaked down hollow cheeks, designer clothes wrinkled from sleeping on the couch. She couldn't remember the last time she'd actually made it to her bed. The basement sounds kept her awake, moving from room to room, trying to escape the constant tap-tap-tapping in the walls. A sharp knock at the door made her jump. Through the peephole, she saw Officer Jenkins standing with what looked like a warrant in his hand. She pressed herself against the wall, holding her breath until his footsteps retreated. They'd be back, she knew. They always came back. The basement. Door rattled, a new sound that sent her scrambling for the kitchen knife block. Had Margaret somehow reached the door? No, impossible. The new locks were secure. She'd checked them obsessively every hour. But the rattling continued, joined by that damn tapping in the pipes that never seemed to stop. "Shut up!" she screamed at the floor, brandishing a knife. "Just shut up! You're dead! You're supposed to be dead!" Her voice echoed through the empty house, bouncing off walls covered in photos of sisterly devotion that now felt like accusations. The safety deposit box key burned in her pocket, useless until the mandatory waiting period expired. 3 more days. Whatever Margaret had hidden away in there was destroying her carefully constructed life before she could even access it. Her sister had always been clever, always thinking 10 steps ahead. Even now, trapped in the basement, Margaret was somehow winning. A movement across the street caught her eye. That Detective Chen was watching again, camera raised. Something about her tugged at Helen's memory, a case from years ago that had almost exposed everything. Denver? No. Pittsburgh. The pieces clicked into place with terrifying clarity. Chen had been involved in the investigation there before Helen had disappeared with a new identity. The realization sent her staggering to her father's old study. She yanked open desk drawers, searching frantically for the backup papers she'd hidden there. New identity, new social security card, new life, all ready to go when she needed a quick escape. But the folder was missing. Fresh panic clawed at her throat. The folder had been there last week, she was sure of it, unless Margaret had found it before, had known all along what Helen really was. The safety deposit box suddenly took on new meaning. Had Margaret collected evidence? For years, waiting for the perfect moment to spring her trap. The basement tapping started again, louder now, more insistent. It was joined by a new sound, sirens in the distance, growing closer. Helen rushed to the front window. 3 police cars were turning onto her street, lights flashing, leading. Then was Officer Jenkins's cruiser. Her options evaporated like morning dew. Running meant confirming their suspicions. Staying meant facing questions she couldn't answer. The basement held her only bargaining chip. Margaret, alive and imprisoned. Living proof of Helen's crimes, but also her last possible leverage. The knife felt heavy in her hand as she approached the basement door. Margaret had taken everything from her, her careful plans, her social standing, her very identity. The police were coming, Chen was watching, and somewhere in that safety deposit box waited evidence that would destroy her completely. She unlocked the basement door with trembling hands. If she was going down, she'd make sure Margaret went first. The knife blade caught the morning light as she took her first step down into the darkness. Let them come. Let them find what was left. Helen Walker had disappeared before, become someone new. She could do it again. But first, she had a score to settle with her sister. Margaret heard the basement door unlock and smiled in the darkness. Her fingers rested on the ancient phone line, finally exposed after 23 days of patient work. She'd made the connection just minutes ago, the dial tone humming softly, against her ear like an old friend. But she hadn't called for help yet. She'd been waiting for exactly this moment. The pipes had told her everything she needed to know. Helen's pacing growing more erratic, the sound of breaking glass above. Police sirens in the distance. Her sister was cornered, and like any trapped predator, she was about to make her final desperate move. Detective Chen had been thorough in her surveillance, exactly as Margaret had hoped when she'd first recognized the former Pittsburgh investigator moving in across the street 3 months ago. Every detail Margaret had shared during their quiet garden conversations last spring had been put to perfect use. The safety deposit box, Helen's past identities, the pattern of elder abuse stretching back decades. Through the tiny window, Margaret could see neighbors gathering on their porches, drawn by the approaching sirens. Mrs. Peterson was there with her ever-present phone, documenting everything. The garden club ladies had been invaluable, their gossip network spreading information faster than any official channels. Each concerned call to the police, each suspicious observation reported, had tightened the noose around Helen's neck. Margaret's makeshift calendar showed its final mark. The mandatory waiting period for the safety deposit box ended tomorrow, but Helen wouldn't wait that long. The evidence Margaret had collected over years, photographs, bank statements, overheard phone calls carefully transcribed, would destroy her sister completely. Helen had always underestimated Margaret's patience, her willingness to play the long game. Footsteps creaked on the stairs, unsteady and threatening. Margaret could picture the knife in Helen's hand without seeing it. Her sister had always favored dramatic gestures. The emergency phone line lay ready, Detective Chen's direct number already half-dialed, but Margaret waited, counting the steps. 7 more until Helen would reach the bottom. 6, 5. The basement's shadows held no more fear for Margaret. 23. Days in darkness had taught her its rhythms, its hiding places, its weapons. The metal shelf bracket, sharpened to a wicked point, pressed reassuringly against her palm. Her years in the ER had taught her exactly where to strike if necessary. Helen's harsh breathing echoed in the confined space. "I know you're down here, Margaret. I know you've been plotting against me. Did you think I wouldn't figure it out? That detective from Pittsburgh? Was that your idea?" Margaret stayed silent, letting the darkness work against her sister. Helen had never been comfortable in the basement, even as a child. Their father's domain of tools and shadows had always unsettled her, made her careless. 3 steps left. Above, through the pipe's network, Margaret could hear the police entering the house. Officer Jenkins's authoritative voice carried clearly. "Helen Walker, this is the police. We have a warrant." Helen's step faltered on the stairs. 2 more to go. Margaret's fingers hovered over the phone's keypad, ready to complete the call that would bring Detective Chen rushing in, but not yet. Let Helen take that final step. Let her show her true nature one last time. The pipes Margaret had used for her psychological warfare now carried the sounds of police searching the house. Helen's breathing turned ragged, panicked. She took the final step into the basement, her designer shoes scuffing on concrete. "It's over, sister dear," Margaret called softly, her voice carrying in the darkness. "The only question is whether you'll face your crimes with dignity or add attempted murder to the charges." The knife glinted as Helen swung it wildly. "Where are you? What did you put in that safety deposit box? Tell me!" Margaret's thumb pressed the final number on the phone. Detective Chen would hear everything now. Sometimes the best weapon was simply knowing when to let your enemy destroy themselves. "I'm right here, Helen," Margaret said calmly. "I've been here all along, watching you unravel. Did you really think you could bury the truth forever?" Detective Chen burst through the front door with her team just as the bank manager called. "Detective, you need to see this. We've opened Margaret Walker's safety deposit box early due to the emergency warrant. The contents, they're far worse than we imagined." Inside the box lay 2 decades of meticulously gathered evidence. Newspaper clippings from 6 different cities, each reporting the suspicious death of an elderly person under their caregiver's watch. Birth certificates showing Helen's multiple identities. Bank statements tracking the movement of stolen funds. But most damning was the video camera, an old model their father had hidden in his workshop years ago, capturing Helen's confession during their final confrontation before Margaret's death. "I've got everything now," Helen had gloated in the footage, unaware of the recording. "Just like the others, they all trusted me, just like you did. The devoted caregiver, the perfect friend, the loving sister. Nobody ever suspects family, do they?" The bank manager's voice shook as she continued reading through the documents. "There's a letter here, Detective, written by Margaret months ago. She knew what Helen was planning. She'd been gathering evidence for years, waiting for her sister to make her final move." Chen's team moved systematically through the house, following the sounds of confrontation from below. The basement door stood open, darkness yawning beyond. Helen's voice echoed up the stairs, high and unhinged. "Where did you hide it, Margaret? What's in that box?" "Everything, Helen." Margaret's calm reply carried clearly. "Every identity you stole, every life you took, every crime you thought you got away with. I learned from the best, didn't I? You taught me how to play the long game." The true will lay atop the pile in the safety deposit box, dated just weeks before Helen's attempt to eliminate her sister. Margaret had left everything to a foundation for elderly abuse victims, with a special fund dedicated to reopening suspicious deaths in retirement communities, her final act of justice for all of Helen's previous victims. "Your mistake," Margaret's voice continued from the basement, "was thinking I was just another helpless old woman. But I had something the others didn't. I knew who you really were. I watched you practice your craft over the years. Denver, Pittsburgh, Seattle, all those lonely people who trusted you, who signed over everything, who died so conveniently." Chen's flashlight beam cut through the basement darkness, revealing Helen backed against the wall, knife trembling in her hand. Margaret stood calmly by the old workbench, a metal tool gripped casually in her fingers. The phone line behind her emitted a soft static, the open connection capturing every word. "The safety deposit box was just insurance," Margaret explained, her voice carrying the weight of years of patient planning. "The real evidence was always you, Helen. Your patterns, your mistakes, your desperation when things started falling apart. Detective Chen has been building this case for years, ever since Pittsburgh. I just gave her the final pieces she needed." Helen's designer outfit was streaked with dust, her careful makeup smeared with tears of rage. "You planned this, all of it. The declining health act, the transfer of assets, letting me think I was winning. It was all a trap." "Of course it was." Margaret's smile held decades of stored knowledge. "I'm a nurse, remember? I spent my life watching for symptoms, tracking patterns, waiting for the right moment to act. You showed all the classic signs of a predator. I just had to wait for you to strike." The police team moved silently down the stairs as Margaret continued. "The will you forged, meaningless. The death certificate you faked, already invalidated. The identity you were going to escape with. I found those papers months ago. It's over, little sister. The truth doesn't stay buried forever." Helen's hand tightened on the knife. For a moment, the basement held its breath. Then Officer Jenkins' voice cut through the tension. "Helen Walker, drop the weapon. You're under arrest." The knife clattered to the concrete as Helen's legs gave way. As they led her up the stairs in handcuffs, her perfectly crafted world collapsing around her, Margaret picked up the ancient phone and finally spoke into the receiver. "Did you get all that, Detective Chen? I think we finally have our confession." The interrogation room at the police station felt smaller with each passing hour. Helen sat hunched in her chair, her designer outfit now wrinkled and stained from the basement confrontation. On the table before her, Detective Chen methodically laid out photograph after photograph, document after document, building a timeline of destruction that spanned 20 years. "Let's start with Denver," Chen said, placing a faded newspaper clipping on the table. "Martha Richardson, 68. You were her home health aide for 6 months before she accidentally overdosed on medication. You inherited everything, then disappeared. Except Martha's grandson was a police officer. He never stopped looking." Helen's manicured nails drummed against the metal table, her only outward sign of stress. The carefully constructed masks she'd worn for decades were peeling away, revealing the hollow beneath. Each piece of evidence exposed another layer of her elaborate deceptions. "Pittsburgh was your mistake," Chen continued, spreading out bank statements. "You got sloppy, used the same signature style on multiple documents. I was a junior detective then, but I never forgot the pattern. When Margaret reached out to me 3 months ago, everything clicked. A flash of rage crossed Helen's face at her sister's name. Margaret was nothing but a burden. She had everything I deserved. The house, the respect, the perfect life. I just took what should have been mine. And Seattle? Phoenix? Miami? Chen's voice remained calm as she placed more photos on the table. Elderly faces smiled up at them, each one another victim who had trusted Helen. Were they all burdens too? Or just convenient targets? In the observation room next door, Margaret watched through the one-way glass. Officer Jenkins stood beside her, recording every word of Helen's gradual confession. The safety deposit box had given them enough evidence for an arrest, but Helen's own words would ensure she never hurt anyone again. You want to know the truth? Helen's composure finally cracked, her voice rising. They were all so pathetically grateful for attention. A few kind words, some basic care, and they'd sign anything. Margaret was different. She saw through me, didn't she? She played me at my own game. Margaret's hand pressed against the glass, studying her sister's face. The childhood memories of shared secrets and sisterly bonds felt like relics from another lifetime. Somewhere along the way, Helen had transformed into something hollow, a predator wearing a caregiver's smile. Tell me about the others, Chen pressed, laying out more documents. The ones we haven't found yet. How many more families are out there wondering what really happened to their loved ones? Helen's laugh held no humor. You think these are all of them? I was careful, professional. Margaret was my mistake, keeping it in the family. I should have known she'd be different. All those years in the ER, seeing the worst in people. She understood darkness, didn't she? The confession spilled out like poison. Years of calculated crimes laid bare under the harsh interrogation room lights. Each revelation added charges to the growing list. Fraud, elder abuse, theft, false imprisonment, attempted murder. The prosecutor, standing quietly in the corner, scribbled notes, building a case that would keep Helen behind bars for life. One thing I don't understand, Chen said, leaning forward. The roses. Why did you keep digging in Margaret's garden? What were you looking for? The original will, Helen spat. I knew she had to have hidden a copy somewhere. Margaret always loved those damn roses. I thought she might have buried it there like some kind of time capsule. But she was cleverer than that, wasn't she? The safety deposit box, so simple, so perfect, Margaret smiled grimly. Helen had never understood that the garden's only secret was patience, the same patience that had allowed Margaret to gather evidence for years, waiting for her sister to reveal her true nature. Each careful note, each preserved document, each recorded conversation had been another seed planted, growing into the proof that would finally bring justice. We've contacted the families of your known victims, Chen continued. But I suspect we'll find more. Patterns like yours leave traces, Helen. And now that we know what to look for, Helen's shoulders slumped in defeat. The masks were gone now, leaving only the truth Margaret had always seen beneath her sister's perfect performance. A predator caught in a trap 20 years in the making. In the observation room, Margaret finally turned away from the glass. Her work was done. The evidence was overwhelming, Helen's confession recorded, and justice would be served not just for her, but for all the victims who had come before. Ready to go home? Officer Jenkins asked gently. Margaret nodded, thinking of her garden waiting to be restored, her life ready to be reclaimed. Helen had underestimated her, just like she'd underestimated all her victims. But Margaret had learned long ago that age brought more than weakness. It brought wisdom, patience, and the strength to wait for justice. The morning sun painted Margaret's roses in shades of victory as she stood in her garden for the first time in 24 days. The neighborhood had gathered on her lawn, not to mourn this time, but to celebrate her return. Mrs. Peterson's eyes brimmed with tears as she hugged Margaret, whispering apologies for not seeing through Helen's deception sooner. Don't apologize, Margaret said, her voice strong despite her ordeal. Helen fooled everyone. That's what predators do. They wear masks so perfect that we doubt our own instincts when we spot the cracks. The media had descended like vultures, hungry for details of the sensational story. Elderly woman fakes own death to catch serial killer sister ran across every local channel. Detective Chen kept them at bay, protecting Margaret's privacy while ensuring Helen's crimes received the attention they deserved. 6 cities, Officer Jenkins announced to the gathered crowd, reading from his official statement. 12 confirmed victims before Margaret. The FBI's Elder Abuse Task Force is reopening cold cases across 3 states. Helen Walker's reign of terror is finally over. The basement door stood open now, morning light streaming down the stairs that had been Margaret's prison. But she hadn't been powerless there. Each day in darkness had been another step in her plan, another piece of evidence gathered, another. A crack in Helen's perfect facade. Show them, Detective Chen encouraged, holding up the old phone Margaret had used to record Helen's confession. Show them how you fought back. Margaret led the neighbors down the basement steps, the calendar scratched into the wall, marking each day of her captivity, drew gasps of shock. The sharpened shelf bracket that had been her last line of defense glinted dully in the light, but it was the network of pipes, her communication system, that had driven Helen to the brink, that drew Detective Chen's admiring nod. 23 days, Margaret explained, running her hand along the copper pipes. 23 days of psychological warfare. Helen thought she could break me, but she forgot what 30 years in the ER taught me about human nature, about patience, about waiting for the right moment to strike. The Garden Club ladies, who had been instrumental in spreading the careful whispers that helped unravel Helen's story, clustered around Margaret protectively. Their gossip network had become a weapon in Margaret's arsenal, each seemingly innocent. Conversation carrying seeds of suspicion that took root in the community's consciousness. The safety deposit box was brilliant, Mrs. Peterson declared, still clutching her ever-present phone. Having all that evidence ready, just waiting for the right moment. You never gave up hope, did you? Margaret smiled, thinking of the years she'd spent gathering proof of Helen's true nature. The hidden camera in their father's workshop had been just the beginning. Bank statements, medical records, newspaper clippings, each piece a bullet in the gun she'd been loading, waiting for Helen to give her a reason to pull the trigger. From the street came the sound of another news van arriving. Through the basement window, Margaret caught a glimpse of Helen's face on the vehicle's side. Her mugshot, a stark contrast to the polished society photos she'd once prized. The headline beneath read, "Black Widow of Elder Care, a 20-year spree of death and deception. The FBI wants to interview you," Detective Chen said quietly. "Your case could help them create new protocols for identifying predators like Helen. Save more lives." Margaret nodded, her nurse's instincts already, considering how her experience could protect others. Helen's not the only predator out there wearing a caregiver's smile. Maybe it's time we taught people what to look for. The basement no longer held any fear for her. She'd transformed it from a prison into a fortress, using its darkness to gather strength, its silence to sharpen her resolve. Helen had thought she was burying her sister alive. Instead, she'd given Margaret the perfect vantage point from which to orchestrate her downfall. As they climbed the stairs back to the sunlight, Margaret paused to look at the calendar scratched into the wall. 23 marks that told a story, not of victimhood but of victory, of patience rewarded, of justice served not just for her, but for all of Helen's victims who had never had the chance to fight back. "The roses need tending," she announced to her gathered neighbors. "Who's ready to help me bring my garden back to life?" The courtroom fell silent as Helen Walker was led in, her designer clothes replaced by prison orange, her carefully maintained appearance now stripped of all artifice. The prosecution had arranged for victims' families from 6 different states to testify, each story adding another layer to the portrait of a predator who had systematically targeted society's most vulnerable members. Margaret sat in the front row, Detective Chen beside her, watching her sister's mask crumble completely as the evidence mounted. The security camera footage from their father's workshop played on the courtroom screens, Helen's own words, damning her more thoroughly than any witness testimony could. "I've done this before," Helen's recorded voice echoed through the chamber. "And I'll do it again. They're all the same, lonely old people desperate for someone to care. It's almost too easy." The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Sandra Martinez, methodically laid out the pattern of Helen's crimes. Bank records showed the systematic draining of victims' accounts. Forged medical records detailed fictional decline. Death certificates, each signed by non-existent doctors, marked the end of lives cut short by Helen's calculated greed. "The defendant preyed on our society's most vulnerable members," Martinez addressed the jury. "She didn't just steal their money, she stole their dignity, their security, and ultimately their lives. But she made one crucial mistake. She underestimated her last intended victim. Margaret Walker wasn't just another target. She was the witness who would finally bring her sister's crimes to light." From the defendant's table, Helen's gaze burned with hatred as Margaret took the stand. But Margaret had faced far worse in her decades as an ER nurse. She testified calmly, detailing not just her own imprisonment, but the years of gathering evidence, watching her sister's predatory pattern emerge. "I recognized the signs," Margaret testified. "The same techniques she'd used on her other victims. Isolating them, spreading rumors of declining health, gradually taking control of their lives. When she started using those tactics on me, I knew I had to do more than just protect myself. I had to stop her permanently." The safety deposit box contents were entered into evidence. Helen's multiple identities, the financial records, the carefully documented timeline of suspicious deaths. But it was the recorded confession from the basement that sealed Helen's fate. The jury listened in horror as she bragged about her crimes, unknowingly sealing her own conviction. Detective Chen's testimony brought the final pieces together. "This was one of the most sophisticated cases of elder abuse we've ever encountered," she explained to the rapt courtroom. "The defendant created an almost perfect system of predation, but she never considered that one of her victims might be stronger, smarter, and more patient than she was." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Helen Walker, along with her 5 other documented identities, was found guilty on all counts: multiple charges of first-degree murder, elder abuse, fraud, false imprisonment, and attempted murder. The judge's sentence was unequivocal: life in prison without possibility of parole. As Helen was led away in handcuffs, she turned one last time to face her sister. "You think you've won?" she snarled. "You're just a bitter old woman who couldn't stand to see me succeed." Margaret's response was calm, delivered with the quiet strength that had sustained her through 23 days of darkness. "No, Helen. I'm a survivor who made sure you'll never hurt anyone else again. The only bitter one here is you." Outside the courthouse, Margaret faced the gathered media with Detective Chen by her side. Her message was clear: elder abuse thrives in silence and isolation, but we're not silent anymore, and we're not alone. To anyone out there being victimized, there is help, there is hope, and there is justice. The FBI's Elder Abuse Task Force had already begun implementing new protocols based on Margaret's case. Helen's methodical pattern of predation had exposed vulnerabilities in the system, gaps that could now be closed. Her final victim had transformed her own trauma into a tool for protecting others. As Margaret walked down the courthouse steps, she saw Mrs. Peterson and the garden club ladies waiting with a surprise. They'd brought her roses, grown from cuttings taken from her garden. Even in winter, the buds promised new life, new growth, new beginnings. 2 months after Helen's conviction, Margaret sat in Detective Chen's living room, reviewing the final case files. The FBI had identified 3 more victims across 2 additional states, bringing Helen's total to 15 lives destroyed. Each New discovery felt like another weight lifted from Margaret's conscience. More families finding closure, more justice served. The patterns were identical, Chen explained, spreading photographs across her coffee table. Once we knew what to look for, the cases practically solved themselves. Seattle, 2015, Phoenix, 2018. Each time, she emerged with a new identity, but the same methodology. Margaret picked up a photo of Helen in her previous life. Blonde hair instead of brown, different name, same predatory smile. Did you find out when it started? What turned my sister into this? Chen hesitated, then pulled out an old newspaper clipping. College years. There was an incident with a wealthy roommate, suspicious accident, substantial insurance payout. Helen was investigated but never charged. That seems to be when she discovered her talent for deception. The revelation settled like frost in Margaret's chest. All those years growing up together, sharing secrets, planning futures. Had Helen always harbored this darkness, or had it grown slowly like poison ivy, choking a garden? The foundation is doing well, Margaret said, changing the subject. The money from her estate, the assets Helen had tried to steal, was now funding a nationwide program for elder abuse prevention. We've already helped 3 families recognize the warning signs and escape their abusers. Chen smiled, the expression softening her detective's facade. You transformed 23 days of captivity into a lifetime of helping others. That's no small achievement. The basement had been renovated, its darkness banished by new windows and bright paint. Margaret had transformed her prison into a meeting space for support groups, turning trauma into healing. The calendar scratched into the wall remained, preserved, behind plexiglass as a reminder that survival took many forms. Helen's previous victims' families are arriving next week, Margaret said, checking her notebook. We're having a memorial in the garden. It felt right somehow, gathering in the place where all this began to honor those who never got the chance to fight back. The roses were blooming again, more vibrant than ever. Each bush had been replanted with care, the garden restored to its former glory. Margaret had added new varieties, one for each of Helen's victims. Their colors filled the yard like a promise kept. Have you visited her? Chen asked carefully, knowing the weight of the question. Margaret nodded slowly. Last week, she's different. Now, smaller somehow. Without her masks, without her performance, there's hardly anything left. She tried to blame me, of course. Said I drove her to it by always being the perfect sister. The prison visit had been illuminating. Helen, stripped of her designer clothes and careful makeup, had seemed almost transparent. Her attempts at manipulation fell flat against the bulletproof glass. Her threats empty in the face of Margaret's calm strength. I told her about the foundation, Margaret continued, about how her crimes would help save others. She hated that. Most of all, the idea that her work, as she called it, would actually protect future victims. It was the first time I saw the real Helen, not the character she played all these years. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through Chen's windows, reminiscent of those basement days when Margaret had learned to use darkness as a tool. But these shadows held no fear now. They were just another reminder of survival, of patience rewarded. The FBI wants you to consult on similar cases, Chen mentioned. Your insights could help identify other predators using the same methods. Margaret smiled, thinking of the ER skills that had kept her alive and clear-headed during her captivity. From nurse to victim to consultant, life takes unexpected turns, doesn't it? A text message lit up Margaret's phone. Mrs. Peterson, checking if she was still coming to garden club tomorrow. The community that Helen had tried to turn against her had become an unwavering support system, each member playing a part in her. Healing? You know what the hardest part is? Margaret said, gathering the case files, accepting that my sister died long before I went into that basement. The Helen I grew up with, the sister I loved, she was just another mask, another performance. I had to mourn her before I could stop her. Chen nodded, understanding the complex grief of loving someone who never truly existed. You turned 23. Days of hell into a legacy of hope. That's not just survival, that's triumph. 1 year after Helen's conviction, Margaret's garden hosted a different kind of gathering. Families from across the country, children, grandchildren, and friends of Helen's victims came together not in grief, but in celebration of lives remembered and justice served. 15 roses, each a different variety, bloomed in a circular pattern, their colors a living memorial to those who had been silenced. Detective Chen, now a close friend, stood beside Margaret as she addressed the gathered crowd. 1 year ago, we were strangers connected by tragedy. Today, we're a family forged by survival and justice. Each of you carried the weight of unanswered questions for years. Today, we lay that burden down together. The Foundation's work had expanded beyond their initial goals. What started as a support system for elder abuse victims had grown into a nationwide network of resources, education programs, and legal advocacy. Margaret's story had opened doors that had been locked for decades, shining light into the shadows, where predators like Helen had operated. Your mother's case helped us identify 2 more suspects last month, Chen told Robert Martinez, son of Helen's Phoenix victim. The pattern recognition protocols we developed from studying Helen's methods are making a real difference. Your mother's death wasn't in vain. Margaret's basement, once her prison, had become a sanctuary. Support group meetings filled the space. With voices of healing and hope, the calendar scratched into the wall remained as a testament to patience and perseverance, its 23 marks reminding visitors that strength could be found in the darkest places. Mrs. Peterson and the garden. Club ladies had become fierce advocates for the Foundation's work. Their gossip network, once Helen's unwitting tool, now served as an early warning system for identifying potential abuse cases in the community. They'd already helped 3 elderly neighbors escape exploitative situations. The roses are Margaret's legacy now, Mrs. Peterson told a young reporter covering the gathering. Each one represents a life Helen tried to destroy, but also a family finding healing. When they bloom, we remember that beauty can grow from even the darkest soil. Inside the house, Margaret had transformed Helen's carefully curated shrine of fake sisterly devotion into a wall of real family photos, victim celebrations, graduations, weddings, all the moments Helen had stolen. Their smiling faces watched over the space where deception had once reigned, replacing artifice with authenticity. The emergency phone line remained connected, though its purpose had changed. Now it served as a dedicated hotline for the Foundation, offering immediate support to those recognizing the warning signs Margaret had documented so carefully. Every call represented another potential life saved from predators wearing caring masks. Sometimes I visit her, Margaret confided to Chen. As the gathering wound down, not because she's changed, she hasn't, but to remind myself that monsters don't always look like monsters. Helen taught me that evil often wears a beautiful face and speaks with a loving voice. The last year had brought changes no one could have predicted. Margaret's case had inspired new legislation, stricter oversight of elder care, and improved methods for tracking suspicious deaths in retirement communities. Helen's methodical predation had exposed systemic weaknesses that were now being strengthened. As twilight settled over the garden, Margaret gathered everyone for a final ceremony. 15 candles were lit, 1 for each life Helen had taken, but beside them burned a 16th flame, for hope, for healing, for the future they were building together. My sister thought she could bury the truth, Margaret addressed the gathered families. She thought age meant weakness, that love could be faked, that justice could be outrun. But she forgot something essential. The strongest flowers are those that push through darkness toward the light. The roses nodded in the evening. Breeze, their petals catching the last rays of sun. In their beauty, Margaret saw not just remembrance but renewal. Each bloom represented not an ending, but a beginning, proof that even after the darkest winter, spring would always return. As the families shared stories and tears and laughter under the stars, Margaret stood in her garden, finally at peace. Helen had tried to write her ending, but instead had only opened a new chapter, one filled not with deception and death, but with truth, justice, and the unstoppable power of resilience.